I am here to talk to you about a little bit about Carl Jung and Jungian psychology. He is somebody I stumbled across as an undergraduate. One of my undergraduate professors was very, very interested in Carl Jung's theory of personal development and growth. And his wife was a Jungian analyst. She had private practice and she treated clients and used the dream approach. Have any of you heard anything about Carl Jung? Is the name, how many of you have heard the name? Okay. How many of you have any idea of what it might all be about? A little bit, sort of. Okay. Well, one of the things that Jung did was he developed what he called analytical psychology. Frequently, people say that he was, if you go to Wikipedia, it'll tell you that he was a student of Freud's. I kind of take issue with that because he was a practicing psychologist, medical doctor, psychologist at the University of Burghölzli in Switzerland before he and Freud ever heard of each other. Freud was about 20 years his senior. Jung was born in 1875, and by 1905 he was practicing medical doctor, practicing psychiatrist, treating patients at the University of Burghölzli. And somewhere around that time, he was acquainted with Freud's book, The Interpretation of Dreams. And because he had been treating patients that he noticed had their fantasies or their hallucinations or their delusions, however you wanted to call it, those seemed to have echoes of very, very ancient patterns. They reminded him of ancient stories of gods and goddesses that he had read as a child. As a child, he had a very lonely, introverted childhood, as he describes it. He was the only child of his parents' 4 children who survived to adulthood. By the time Jung was born, his parents had already had 3 children who died in infancy and early childhood. During his first 4 years of life, his mother suffered from a very serious depression and was hospitalized for this a couple of times. And his father was a pastor in a rural parish in Switzerland. And so he felt he apparently couldn't cope with raising his son by himself. So he sent this little guy to live with his mother's sister, with his aunt, who was unmarried, and there were no other children there. And so this little guy had a lot of separation in his first 4 years of life. And he believed later, as he looked back on it, that played a role in his early development. He described himself as being lonely, kind of what we would today probably call a loner, and very introverted. And he spent a lot of time after he was returned to living with his father and had started school. He spent a lot of time in his father's library and reading ancient texts and myths. And so he was very well grounded. Plus he had a European education, which at that time meant that you were trained in Latin, Greek, you were introduced to the classics. And so this was all part of who he was as he was growing up. So when he got to his position at the mental hospital, and students were, not students, clients, patients, were telling them, talking to him, and he was trying to help them, and they would tell some of their fantasies, their beliefs that they had. He kept recalling, he recognized a pattern. He recognized that there were very similar patterns among some of these fantasies, these hallucinations, these delusions that were being told to him. And rather than dismissing them, as was typical of the time, as just nonsense and, what we might say in plain language, crazy talk, he decided to take it seriously. That maybe in some way these people were trying to communicate with him. And rather than dismiss it, he wanted to try to make sense out of it. So it was somewhere around this time that Freud released his book, The Interpretation of Dreams. And Jung immediately read it, was very, very interested in it because he thought that Freud was articulating some ideas that he could possibly use to help his patients at the hospital and ideally help them improve. So he wrote a letter to Freud, introducing himself, and started a correspondence with him. In 1906, he published his dissertation, which he actually developed the forerunner of what has become, what eventually grew into the lie detector test. He did word association test, but he timed how long it took his subjects to respond to different words. And he used that mathematical measure of length of response time to determine what words seemed to center around the longest response time, and he concluded or hypothesized that area would be where the issue was that each patient was dealing with. And so, excuse me, he had published this, and he sent a copy of it to Freud. So the letter to Freud about the book and sending his book came fairly close in time. And Freud wrote back to him. And they maintained this relationship of conversation, dialoguing with each other for several years before they finally met, at least 2 or 3 years before they finally met in person. And when they first met, as Jung recalled it, they talked for 13 hours straight. Now, I enjoy talking, but that's a long marathon session. And what they covered were all of the implications, the conceptual framework, the foundation of how Freud saw the unconscious working and how Jung saw it working. And Jung took this as an exchange between a senior colleague and a junior colleague. There's some evidence that Freud, however, because Jung was a Christian, he was not Jewish, which was very different from everyone else who was in Freud's early circle at that time. He saw in Jung a potential heir to promote the psychoanalytic movement to the entire world. Up until that time, it had been viewed as kind of a very Jewish thing, and Jews were treated as second-class citizens. One of the reasons that Freud went into private practice to begin with, he was a neurologist studying the nervous system at the university in Vienna, but he could never rise to the level of becoming a professor because he was Jewish. So he was relegated to very ancillary positions. He could do the research, he could run the research lab, he could run the research discussion group, but he could never be a professor. And he wanted to begin a family, and he couldn't support a family on that wage that he earned there. So he left the university and established a private practice. And because of his background in treating and studying the nervous system, he was sent a lot of patients that others couldn't help. And at that time, what we're used to talking about now as more of a psychological issue or an emotional problem, during the late 1800s, early 1900s, those were considered nervous conditions. And so medical treatment was prescribed. What Freud discovered fairly quickly is that he initially tried hypnosis, which later Jung admitted he had tried as well for his patients. And he discovered that he could get the same benefits for his patients by having them talk, just free associate. And in a sense, Jung was attracted to that because they were both, in their own ways, taking what the patients were saying seriously. Now, after their relationship lasted about 6 years. And during that time, Freud made it more and more clear that he expected Jung to take over the leadership of psychoanalysis. That was the name of this. And Jung belonged for a few years to the Psychoanalytic Society. And when their final falling out came, part of it was the fact that Jung conceptually did not agree with some of Freud's basic ideas. He felt that psychoanalysis was focused far too much on illness. It was focused on somebody's broken, there's something wrong with this person, therefore it's up to psychoanalysis to fix it. And it's up to the psychoanalyst to tell the patient what's wrong with him or her, because the patient isn't obviously going to be able to figure that out by himself. Jung objected to this, and he felt that it was a long, slow process before their final break. But for Freud, he felt the basic motivating drive, what causes people to do what we do, can be explained fundamentally in terms of the energy drives in the id, which are primarily, he identified them as primarily sexual and later aggression. Jung fundamentally disagreed with this because he believed there was more to people than sex and aggression. And so he kept trying to introduce into Freud's, into the dialogue that he and Freud were having, he wanted to introduce the issue that he felt he had seen his patients dealing with, and that was the issue of being connected to something meaningful, something bigger than themselves, that he believed in. He called this need spirituality, but in the sense not that it applied to a specific religious orientation, but rather that it applied to this idea of the fact that humans can't possibly know all there is to know to life. And therefore, there's always going to be a level of mystery about human existence. And he believed that that need of humans to find meaning in mystery and somehow establish a connection to that was really the underlying motivating force of life. And it didn't always work out right or well, but he felt that was the driving force. Yes, sex was important. Yes, we needed to defend ourselves. Yes, Freud was right, but Freud didn't go far enough as far as Jung was concerned. So that's one of the reasons that as Freud and Jung started to distance themselves from each other, Jung formed what he called analytical psychology. He deliberately introduced the term psychology, which at that early time in the early 20th century wasn't considered a highly reputable endeavor. And he made a statement. His statement was, no, we need to find out how to help individuals become healthy. That this is about personal growth. It's not about, if we only stay focused on the problems, if we only stay focused on illness, then we're never going to be able to achieve what we could potentially achieve as a human being. We won't reach the fullness of it if we stay stuck essentially in our illnesses. So he proposed instead that analytical psychology would help individuals develop themselves and achieve their own potential. Now, this was a long, slow process as far as Jung was concerned. Initially, if you read things about Jung, written about Jung by contemporaries, you get the picture, one can get the picture that he might have been somewhat arrogant and distant. Later, he describes himself as an introvert and a thinker. He identifies how people are, how personalities can be described as having different functions. And he identified himself as being an introverted thinker, which meant that he could kind of take a problem and look at it very objectively, and at the same time, cut himself off from any emotional response to it. So some of his early cohorts would sometimes describe him as being arrogant. And it's entirely likely that somebody who operates that way could very well be perceived as arrogant and be totally oblivious to the judgments that anybody was making about him. So it's almost, from the years of reading that I've been doing, it's almost as though there are, I see it almost as two different Jungs. There's the early Jung and his work at the Berg-Holtze Hospital, the relationship with Freud, the friendship, the development, the philosophical dialogue that took place between them. And then there was his private life, which there was a very, acceptable double standard in Victorian, or it would be Edwardian times, that he lived, in which an upstanding person of the community certainly could have have a wife and family. It was expected, but may also have a mistress or two on the side. And so in his private life, he was engaging in things that we probably wouldn't. He according to the writings of his contemporaries and himself, he had, over the course of his life, he had several mistresses with whom they were students as well as his mistresses. It was always engaged in this intellectual as well as physical relationship. And through that, we learn, and through his issues in terms of dealing with that, I think that during I think it's about 17, 18 years that he wrote what has become known as the Red Book. Have any of you heard of the Red Book? I'm going to treat myself to that as a retirement present, and then I'm going to sit home and just read that all day long and see what I think about it. So I haven't had time to do that yet. But during that time, he put together selected writings from the journals that he kept. He went through a very serious depression after the break with Freud. The break with Freud was about 1912. And during that time, he describes himself as having, he feared he was having a mental breakdown himself because he was dreaming about chaos. He was dreaming about Europe being awash in blood. And he was almost relieved when World War I broke out because he realized that somehow his unconscious was somehow picking up energy, messages. We would probably call them vibes today. And he tried to come up with a logical explanation for why he should be experiencing this. And so he began then to, during this time, World War II, or World War I, I'm sorry, he couldn't travel. He was drafted into the Swiss Army. Even though Switzerland was neutral, they maintained prisoner of war camps. If any soldiers from the warring nations made it into Switzerland, they were all interned. They were kept there till the end of the war and then returned to their respective countries. So he was drafted and became the doctor and commandant of a prison camp. So he had some extra time on his hands there too. He couldn't continue the traveling throughout Europe and to the United States to give lectures that he had been doing. So this became the beginning of a very, very introverted period for him, where he wound up through his journaling working out major components of his theory that we have, that we can read about today, that we have kind of understand now as the foundational belief system, so to speak, of Jungian psychology. One of the things that he introduced that you've probably all heard about is a collective unconscious. He deliberately connected the word collective with this because he felt that Freud's idea of the unconscious was a personal unconscious. And the personal unconscious that Freud talked about contained the personal information from each individual's life. Memories that were repressed, memories that were forgotten, perceptions that maybe never ever made it into consciousness in the first place, past experiences. And those were much more individual to each person. But beyond that, Jung believed that there was another energy field. One of the ways that I have seen it described, I did not come up with this diagram, and I don't remember where I first encountered it, but I am giving credit to whoever came up with it. It's not my idea. This is one way to think about describing it. One of the things that Freud said, can you all hear me okay, or am I bouncing in and out? Good. Okay. One of the things that Freud said was that consciousness was like the tip of the iceberg. That only a very small portion of it was available to our rational way of thinking, our awareness. And everything else was part of the personal unconscious. And this is where the id, aspects of the superego, even some aspects of the ego, such as the defense mechanisms, were located. And not everything, according to Jung, that was in here was necessarily negative or traumatic. It was, however, highly individual. Now, where does the collective unconscious come in? For Jung, there is a field, and all of us have access. These are individual people, individual icebergs. Now, a two-dimensional diagram doesn't really give you the whole thing. I've been racking my brain trying to come up with an example that might make a little bit more sense to you. So come with me on this journey. Let's say you've got a kiddie swimming pool in your backyard, and it's very deep. Then you take some small pieces of PVC, open on both ends, and we'll pretend that they're weighted on one end so they'll stay upright instead of tip over and float. So you put some of these in the pool. And what's happening is there's a certain amount of the water that's trapped inside this container. But at the same time, that same water is also all around the container. Does that make sense? Because for Jung, the collective unconscious is not something that is inside each of us. It is something that is somehow outside of us that we have access to, that we can be almost embedded in, so that we don't know which is what. And if you took a little bit of food coloring and put it inside one of the containers, depending on how much you put in and how long you left it, some of that may eventually seep out into the rest of it, while a lot of it would still stay inside it. And what Jung is saying is that the collective unconscious is like the rest of that little pool of water, and it holds all of those energy patterns. In some of his theorists who are more contemporary today and continue his work, talk about it as the evolutionary history, that the collective unconscious holds the evolutionary psychological history of human beings. And they are present in the form of archetypes. Okay, let me see. I need to make room here. Of course, I'm going to do it by dropping things. Okay, I'm going to do, I just heard this morning, so I'm waiting to use it. I'm going to do a Marco Rubio, and I'm going to disappear from the screen for a moment while I get my eraser. Okay, I'm back. All righty. So we can think then about these archetypes as being present in here. And when Jung was once asked, well, what's connecting the archetypes, he introduced this concept. Now, he was very much European. He was very much influenced by the phenomenologist philosophers of the time. And so for him, being was simply a word given to ultimate existence. One way that I have found it helpful to think about being is something that other more Eastern philosophies have called things like life force, prana, energy, chi. It is something that gives life to everything that's alive in the universe. And that's the level of mystery that Jung wanted to try to explain human behavior as trying to achieve an understanding of whatever that was. And he used archetypes. He felt archetypes were not full-blown ready-made ideas or personas or anything like that. They were potential patterns of behavior. That were theoretically accessible to all people, but may or may not be accessed by all of them. There needed to somehow be a match between a situation or an environment and a situation that at any given point in time may trigger an archetypal response in a given individual. Now that probably sounds about as clear as mud. Anybody got any questions? Because I'm going to go on and try to make it a little clearer. Okay. There are certain situations that all humans experience in the sense that they're part of who we are as human beings. Obviously, birth, growth, some kind of community, recognizing a committed relationship. Whether or not it is considered marriage in that culture or not is kind of beside the point. But there's a recognition that certain things happen. And in a sense, we could consider the major events of life as archetypal events. And with those archetypal events, there are also energy fields. When a child is born, people are happy. And as a developmental psychologist who also worked as an operating room nurse for a few years, I can tell you that I've had firsthand experience at a C-section delivery, birth of a child, where everybody, they were usually emergency surgeries, and the baby came out healthy, the mom came out healthy. Everybody was literally high because we were tapped in. You know, if we explain it physiologically, our endocrines were going sky high there, endorphins. We were just as psyched as everybody else who was really connected to the baby, even though we didn't know them. What Jung would say about that is that's because everybody that was there had this archetypal experience at the same time. And this particular archetypal experience typically brings with it a lot of joy. And so people were able, in varying degrees, to kind of tap into that emotional pattern. Does that make sense? Okay. Another example, and I'm way behind on my movies, so forgive me. My kids told me if I ever get into a Jeopardy game, do not pick pop culture, because I'm going to go nowhere fast with that one. So right now I'm having a hard time thinking of a more recent movie, but I guess I'm just going to have to go back to some old ones. The kind of response when there's a danger situation, you guys all think of something that fits this and shout it out at me, okay? When there's a danger situation, what happens frequently is people forget about themselves individually and immediately try to help who's in danger. And we call it, when there's a large group and nobody's helping, in psychology, we call that bystander apathy. And we all know that when there's only one person around that can possibly help, that person is going to attempt to help. And what Jung would say is that's because an archetypal energy pattern has been activated to that. As humans, we survive because other people survive with us. We can't survive in isolation. We have to be part of a group to survive. So if one member of the group is threatened, we usually don't sit and think about whether or not we're going to do it. People who are in the military, who have been in combat situations, describe that as almost, a given that that's going to be happening during those times. And you don't think about is this a good idea or a bad idea. So an archetypal energy pattern is a potential behavior pattern that we can access if the situation is appropriate to trigger it. Okay. Now, another thing that Jung tells us, and is part of his belief system, is that we don't ever access the archetype directly. what we get are complexes. And the complexes contain cultural and personal experiences. And so I'm going to go back to an iceberg. Make it a little bit bigger. Down here is the collective unconscious. Here is consciousness. And this is the personal unconscious. It looks kind of dumb to call it PU, but it's faster. Now, a complex exists, according to Jung, in here, within the personal unconscious of the individual. But its source is an archetype here that has been activated. Okay, so it's in the collective unconscious. We can think of the energy, the motivation, power moving through the personal unconscious. As it moves through the personal unconscious, it acquires, it attracts. Think of it as a magnet. And the different events, different situations, different cultural experiences in the individual person's unconscious are like iron filings that connect to this magnetic energy. I'm using this kind of, as an analogy, not literally. But this magnetic energy then is coming up through, making its way to consciousness, and as it does, it attracts all of these other experiences, even though they're unconscious. And it also is influenced by the culture, because we each come from cultures that say there are certain things that are appropriate. You may do these things. There are others that aren't. And so we don't realize how much those become part of us too. And so as this is happening, eventually it is the complex that makes its way to consciousness and then has an influence on the behaviors that the individual produces. But for Jung, the archetype itself always remains untouched. Now, what he did spend a lot of time talking about were symbols. He believed that a symbol could be a person, place, thing, or situation that represents something more than itself. It stands for something greater than itself, and it is not arbitrary. One example might be in a movie. At the end of the movie, let's say, or even during the movie, let's say that a character, one of the main characters, is dying or dies. What might happen at that point? The movie? Keep going, because you're going to have to fill me in on it. Okay, I haven't seen the movie. I'm really bad. But what I was thinking of is a light goes out, a candle goes out. Shakespeare uses that in his plays. It's that kind of a thing, that's a symbol of life ebbing away kind of thing. I'm going to have to watch Pulp Fiction now because I'm hooked. I think I was That's older. I should have seen it, but there are so many movies that I can't tell you. I've only seen parts of them because I had to go put kids to bed or finish grading something. And so I have a lot of snippets of movies hanging around in my head. Okay, but what a symbol does is creates a response in a person. One example for people in the US was after 9/11, you couldn't find an American flag in the stores because they were all sold out. The American flag was seen by many people as a symbol of the people, of the country. Other cultures have other symbols that are powerful, that they have powerful responses to. And what Jung is saying is if it's a symbol, it has, in the collective unconscious, an archetype of some kind connected to it. And it will produce an emotion. And that's how you know that an archetype has been activated. Fred.
So
Frank.
the symbol itself is socially constructed. But the American flag,
That's a social construction.
but that for it to be a powerful symbol, a meaningful symbol, somehow it has to connect itself to the collective unconscious.
And he would also say, because he's kind of equivocal here, he would also say that there are some natural symbols.
Yes.
And those natural symbols are more powerful than a constructed symbol.
They emerge.
Yes, they're spontaneous. They're spontaneous emergence from the collective unconscious. Any other questions? I'm reminded here of a book. I don't know if any of you have read it or not, and if not, I recommend it. It's very short. It's called Man's Search for Meaning, and it's written by Viktor Frankl. It is one of the most powerful books I've ever read in my life. And Frankl was a psychiatrist in Vienna, and he was Jewish. He turned down an opportunity to escape the Nazi regime because his parents could not get visas to leave. So he decided to stay there with them and try to protect them as long as he could. Eventually, they were all interred in concentration camps, and all but Frankl, every one of Frankl's family, including his wife, perished in the concentration camps except Frankl. And one would think that that would just make for some incredibly bitter person. But what Frankl did was somehow manage to transcend that experience. And one of the things he talked about was staying connected to nature. That as long as the prisoners could see a sunrise, or another patient saw a tree going through the changes of the seasons, that was a symbol for those individuals of life is going to go on even if I'm not going to be part of it. It was connecting them to a higher source of meaning. And it had a powerful emotional connection with it. So for Jung, a natural symbol, which just emerges spontaneously, is going to bring with it an energy, an emotional impact. And that when we've got these two things occurring, we know that an archetype has been activated. Now, there are a lot of people, Jung started talking about what the archetypes were and kind of gave some of them names. Some people have gotten the impression that we've got this cast of thousands of characters walking around inside us. And that's not exactly accurate. Instead, we have the potential access to these energy patterns. And if our culture allows us, doesn't forbid contact with certain kinds of, or expressions of certain kinds of behavior, then we are going to be likely to tap into it. And for Jung, these archetypal images and symbols were frequently delivered to the people, to individuals, through dreams. Freud kind of saw dreams as I'm totally losing the word I wanted, which I really hate, and it's a bad thing to do in lectures. Disguised, as disguised wishes, that the conscious mind found repulsive, and therefore the dream's job was to turn these things around and put them in a form that the conscious mind couldn't really recognize, and so wouldn't know what the unconscious really wanted. Okay, for Jung, the dream is a little bit more straightforward. For Jung, the dream is actually giving us information that if we can remember it and ponder it, reflect on it, take the message seriously, it's a potential for helping us improve our lives. And he also said that some dreams are just probably indigestion. And again, so not every single dream has an earth-shattering message for us. And again, the clue that this might be an important dream is there a strong emotional trace to this when we wake up? With a really important dream that has a lot of archetypal content, Jung felt that there was also an emotional recognition when the dreamer woke up. They knew it was important, even if they didn't have any idea what the dream meant. Let me just check my notes here a minute, make sure I'm covering everything I wanted to cover. I have a couple of quotes from Jung, which I have not memorized, so I'm just going to read them to you. It's more of his elaboration on what archetypes are. Quote, "The archetype is a tendency to form representations of a motif, representations that can vary a great deal in detail without losing their basic pattern. There are, for instance, many representations of the hostile brethren, but the motif itself remains the same." And so when you talk about motifs, you can also use our perhaps more familiar word of patterns. And the hostile brothers. You can look in Egyptian mythology and you find the story of Set murdering his brother Osiris. You can go to the Judeo-Christian Bible and you find the story of Cain murdering his brother Abel. You can move a little further on in the Old Testament and you find Joseph being sold into slavery by his brothers. So, and other cultures have similar stories. And what he's saying is that pattern of animosity between brothers is a collective archetypal pattern. It's been going on since human beings started populating the planet. And that we need to be aware of it. And the stories tell us, these stories that have come down to us intact, tell us what are the repercussions of such animosities that are carried out. And that those then become learning experiences for us. We don't have to, ideally, go through the experience of hating one's brother and doing damage to each other to realize the negativity that is caused by that. So what Jung believes is dreams play an important role in the development of the human being. And he really thought that roughly the first 35 years of life, we spend starting to get our act together, dealing with our childhoods, establishing ourselves as an more or less independent adult, and then we get to spend the rest of our lives figuring out who we are and improving ourselves. So it doesn't look like there's golden years of rest anywhere for any of us, if we believe Jung's ideas. Now he calls that process calls that process of developing into who one really is as the process of individuation. And one of the archetypal patterns that he does talk about is the self with a capital S. And this is where he has caught some flack from different theologians. For him, this self represents, is a term he uses to represent the wholeness and fullness of being. And for some people, he acknowledges that that might be, that what is out there as the fullness of being may be what some people call God. He didn't take it that far. He said that this self is an image of wholeness. It's an archetype that, in a sense, pulls us to our destiny of becoming a fully individuated person. And that the reality is none of us are ever, ever, ever going to get there completely, where we bring everything that we have in our unconscious into complete consciousness. But that's the goal. It's sort of like striving toward the impossible dream. And that no matter, it doesn't matter that we don't necessarily make it, the point is we're working towards it. It's more like it's not the destination, it's the journey. And this journey is a lifelong process of trying to discover who the real self really is. And I suggest that a lot of the medieval legends and other stories of other cultures, such as the search for the Grail, is an expression of that same sort of concept, but in much different terms and with a different awareness of consciousness that the medieval period was able to, express compared to what Jung was able to express a little later. Okay, I really think that Jung became who he was and worked on the bulk of his theory probably from about 1914 to probably the late 1920s, early 1930s. And then he slowly started publishing these essays. And he kept his own private journals. The Red Book does not contain all of the contents of his journals from that time. There are still some things that his family has not released to the public. He has a collected works volume where he has put together all of these different ideas, and someone has tried to help him organize them according to subject. That's another of my goals, is to work my way through, I think there's 23 collected volumes. So I'm going to be doing that sometime. Probably not while I'm still teaching. And the approach that Jungians take is to look at patterns, to step back, to try to identify what the patterns are and what can we learn from the knowledge that our species has already acquired about similar patterns. One contemporary approach is taken by a man named Dr. Michael Conforti. He was initially trained as a psychoanalyst, and then after he was practicing as a psychoanalyst in New York for a while, he then entered the Jungian Institute, and I think he was trained in New York. And he is now a Jungian analyst. He's been a consultant to movie makers, because they've called him in to see if their story plot line fits archetypally, or if they're stuck on something, what might be an archetypal resolution to this. He has an institute in Vermont now where he trains individuals through on-site and through distance learning and conference calls and things like that, personal connections, to become pattern analysts, and to also then, sort of like becoming, you're familiar with coaching, life coaching experiences. Well, he's preparing individuals to do it from making use of a Jungian perspective without necessarily providing Jungian therapy. And so that's one of the routes that it's going. There are numerous, the closest Jungian institute to us in Grand Rapids is the Jung Institute in Chicago. And they too train therapists there. And it's a very long process. They have a large screening that you go through, and you have to go through a couple of years of Jungian analysis yourself before they agree to accept you into the program to train you to become a Jungian analyst. So it's a very, very involved program. And Jung lived until the age of 86, maybe 80. He died about 2 weeks before his 86th birthday in 1961. And there isn't any nice, short, little handy-dandy version of his theory that somebody has all neatly put together. You kind of have to find it in bits and pieces. But if anybody's interested, I can give you some potential sources, books that are not written by Jung, but that are trying to clearly explain his theory and his work. Yes, Frank?
One statement, one question. The statement is, since we are fortunate enough to have shared a similar mentor, same mentor,
Mm-hmm.
one of the things that might be useful, and I've used this since the 30 years or so ago when I studied with him, is that the value of how the archetypes inform us about great art.
Oh.
And the idea that what makes a piece of art great, whether it's music or a painting, is that it is a manifestation of the collective unconscious. And it touches us in a way which we don't understand because it's communicating to us something that's bigger than us. And that really is the distinguishing feature between just an average piece of art and a piece of art that has sustained itself for hundreds or thousands of years.
Thank you. I totally forgot that piece
And that's
of
just-
information from Rule.
Yeah, and that piece is just, it's always stuck with me.
And I look at, I'm going to have to watch Pulp Fiction now. I guess there's just no way about it. I'm thinking that there was probably something in that particular scene that made you think of it and that you were responding to that would fit, not necessarily the whole movie or anything, but just that particular piece of it. Did it fit with what Dr. Connor described?
But I
Okay.
think that gets to my second question then, is that as an individual on a path towards individuation, we do come in contact with a symbol, a person, an experience, an image that evokes an emotion.
Mhm.
We don't know where it's coming from, but clearly, and it could be a dream, certainly, but it could be just a happenstance interaction with somebody on the street, but we know that it evokes an emotion.
Mhm.
Could you elaborate on that, where that's coming from, what we need to do with it?
Well, where it's coming from is some kind of archetypal pattern that may not even have a clear name, has been activated in the unconscious. And I think what we need to do after that is try to spend some time thinking about what was there a piece of this that meant more? how did I feel? What part of this did I respond to? Kind of like your question about a very specific thing. What produced a powerful response? Maybe if we've got time, journal about it, or at least write it down. If possible, talk it over with someone else who has similar, ideas to you. You don't have to have a private therapist to be able to, discuss these kinds of things with close friends that are thinking along the same lines that you are. I remember one of the things that our mentor told me when I was first teaching and trying to finish my dissertation and dealing with a newborn. And I was like, I am ready to quit right now because I can't do this. I'm not tough enough. And I was talking to him about it, and he said, if it's your path, you'll be able to do it. He said, he used the example of the sword and the stone, not the Disney version. But the story of Arthur pulling the Excalibur out of the stone, that no one else could do it. And I think that what I found helpful was using that image. So I think one of the things is if you can try to connect some story that you know somewhere to that emotion that you've experienced, that becomes one way of trying to work your way down the path. Does that make sense?
I think that we need to listen to that guttural response. We need to pay attention to it and
Yes.
get meaning out of it.
Yes.
Because we might be on the right path, and more than not, we've deviated from the path, and something is telling us
To get back.
to go back.
Yes.
And that was going to be my question, is that like the Freudian perspective on reoccurring dreams is that you're not paying attention to something.
Actually,
How does the unconscious, like, putting symbols in front of us? Is it like that are trying to get our attention until we notice them?
Jung would definitely agree with that. Yes. And then what he also would say is if you're not paying attention to the dreams, then you might just get some of those messages manifesting in real life. You run into someone who reminds you of an earlier goal that you've strayed from and starts recalling some of those things, and then it helps you get back in the process of becoming who you are. That would definitely be one way that he would look at it. But yeah, the idea is try to figure out what it means. Now, for those who are more introverted and who are always trying to figure out what things mean, individuation process might actually be a little easier than it is for a more extroverted person who looks for, not because they're outgoing and talkative, but Jung's idea of an extrovert was that it's a person who looks outside of herself or himself to see what the rest of the culture or people around him are saying or doing in order to interpret his own experiences. Whereas for Jung, an introverted person was one who took it inside and didn't really pay much attention to what others thought about this, but sat with it and processed it himself.
Could you speak to Jung's influence, like on the Myers-Briggs Tyrannic and the 12-step program?
Yes, thank you. Myers-Briggs Inventory was developed by Isabella Myers and actually it was her daughter. I can't remember her, Catherine, I think, Briggs. And they took Jung's idea of, first of all, two basic personality orientations, that of introversion and extroversion. And it didn't mean quiet and outgoing the way it has come to be used in psychology today. It meant where does the individual orient herself or himself to in terms of figuring out one's way. And some people are just very evenly balanced between the two. He also identified major feeling functions. He himself believed himself to be a thinker. Thinking was his highest, most preferred function. He contrasted that with the function of feeling. Feeling is that an individual did not necessarily, it was not irrational, but your first response to something is, how do I feel about that, not what do I think about that. I guess that's the best way to describe it. So that's one set, thinking and feeling. He also talked about intuition and sensing. And intuition is someone that just learns to trust the gut instinct and relying on that. And the sensation is the individual is looking at the pieces of information that he or she can gather from their sensory environment. Perception and judging. Feeling and judging go together, and perception and sensation go together. Judging is having to make a pronouncement that it's good or bad, right or wrong. Something cannot just be. It has to be able to be categorized in a particular way. That is the judging function. And the feeling function, opposite that, is more you feel what the value of it is rather than having to think about what is it worth. And then the perception is more of, again, kind of an unspoken, nonverbal assessment of a situation or an encounter. And it just kind of, how does it appear to you, rather than what are the sensory pieces of information that you built this judgment upon. And so Myers was trained in Chicago, and what she did was she and then her daughter tried to develop a measurement scale. They tried to come up with an instrument that would allow a therapist to give it to an individual and identify that particular person's Jungian type. And they came up with every possible permutation. And so in that scale, you can get 16 different subtypes. And usually, people are recognizing themselves, fairly close. If the individual is close on the scores of matching pairs, what the Myers-Briggs test says is basically they're fairly well balanced. They're using all of their capabilities in a balanced way. Usually, people are more one-sided in one area or another. And when they're more one-sided in one area, it means that there are going to be some weaknesses in their decision-making process at various times if they remain unaware of what their weaknesses are. Now, lately it's undergone some criticism. Some feel it's really not that clearly effective. For a while, I don't know if it still is being used, but for a while, a number of companies used it as part of their personnel testing and trying to figure out if this person would be a good match for this particular kind of job. I have found it helpful to periodically, when I'm teaching senior level courses, to give it to my students and then look it over, and we talk about these differences and things, and then I try to use it to figure out, okay, I'm not having any success getting this concept across here. How can I switch and present it in a way that this person's personality type would understand it more clearly? And, that can be more or less successful.
I think a lot of our students have taken the Percy-Bates, which is a really accessible.
Oh, I think that's based on that.
And so I just thought that people didn't know.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, because I know that we have some of those tests available in our counseling center, but the university has gotten so big that the psych department for teaching, the academic department and the counseling department might as well be in different places because there's not a lot of contact and overlap. But they are helpful for that. There was a more recent shortened version of it. I don't think it was the Kersey one. I think there was another one, a revision that they worked on that Meyer's daughter worked on with this other person to try to enhance its effectiveness. About 2 years ago, I was at a conference, and it was really interesting because there was a person presenting there who taught in an art institute. And he told about their experiences that this one year, they had a group of first-year art students come in who were totally unlike the students they usually got. And they weren't connecting. It's like they didn't get what the instructors were trying to present to them, and the instructors couldn't figure out what planet these students had all arrived from. So one of them had the idea to give the Myers-Briggs. And they gave it to all the instructors, and they gave it to the students. And this whole group of, most of them turned out to be, now I don't know the Kersey test, so does that still give you INFP and ENFP? Okay, most of their students in the past had been INFP with a few ENFPs. Okay, this one whole first year class were ISTJs. They were just totally diametrically opposed to the teachers. And so then they went, okay, now how do we alter our teaching so that we are presenting the information in a way that is compatible with the way these students process the information? And I found that to be one of the most fascinating presentations at the entire conference, was that, wow, that makes a lot of sense. And it also, I know that some marriage counselors use it as well, because sometimes the problems in a marriage relationship can come from two different ways of processing. I finally found out when I gave my sister and her husband the test why my brother-in-law and I got along better than my sister and I did. Because he and I were the same personality type, and she was our exact opposite. So it was an interesting experience.
I think the value of that, and for students to understand too, the value of personality, and certainly the Myers-Briggs being certainly through the Kersey Bates, which you can do free online if you just search for Kersey Bates, and it's a pretty accurate.
Kersey.
K-I-E-R-S.
Kieers.
E-Y.
EY.
Bates.
You can do an abridged Myers-Briggs as well.
Okay. Is that, and I'll go back again to Roll when he gave me the Myers-Briggs,
Mhm.
and then interpreted. One of the things I remembered so clearly is that he was able to predict that I'm just terrible at like remembering names. My personality profile is such that I can't remember pieces.
Ah.
So I don't know, I can't remember street names, but I can tell you how to go anywhere. But because my personality, the way I perceive the world and the way I make sense out of the world is not different, it's just what's right for me.
Mhm.
What's helpful about that, and what's been helpful, again, 30 plus years afterwards, is that there's not anything wrong with me because I'm not good at remembering names. That
Yes.
it's simply my personality.
It's
and the
who
way
I
in which-
am.
Right, it's the way in which I engage in the world. And so, while I wish I could remember names, I also have other qualities that are valuable who make me who I am.
Mhm.
And so when we think about these assessment tools, like the Kersey Bates or the Myers-Briggs, is that it helps us be less judgmental about ourselves, and because each one of us have a certain personality and we engage in the world in a certain way.
Yes. And I think that a really important part of that is even if you don't know your own type so to speak, if you can just remember that, it can help, in my experience, parenting. Little kids do not come into the world as blank slates waiting for you to just mold them and paint them in your particular colors. They're their own people from day one. And if you can remember that, okay, they're doing things differently than I do, but does that necessarily mean it's wrong? So it can carry over into every aspect of life. You don't have to take the test just to keep your message in mind. Any other questions?
I don't want to dominate, but very briefly, I just always been curious how you ended up with the substance abuse 12-step program.
Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you for bringing me back to that, and then I'll get your question back there. Jung had in his therapy practice, he personally treated not Bill W., but a person with whom Bill W. founded AA. And he wasn't getting anywhere with the therapy and the man's alcohol abuse problem. And so he wrote on the prescription pad, spiritus contra spiritus, and handed it to him and said, basically, you are not going to deal with your problem until you get right with your Lord. And the translation of that is you must use the spirit against the spirits of alcohol. And then he carried on a brief correspondence with Bill W. and answered some of the questions there and the importance of having a meaning-based practice of whatever that is. And one of the things that AA does is they talk about the God of your understanding. It is not pushing any particular religion on anyone. And there are some people who acknowledge that for many years, the God of their understanding turned out to be the information they got from the group, because their experiences had pushed them so far away from any kind of organized religion that they weren't able to connect to that. And so that is the connection there. It's one step removed from Bill W., but they did communicate a few times. They exchanged letters a few times.
Between that and the Chrissy
We're going to have to rely on Dr. Connor.
Yeah, the Chrissy base is simply a reorientation of the Myers-Briggs, but it's free. No, you're going to come up with the same profile. I mean, I've taken a formal Myers-Briggs, under the supervision of a PhD psychologist, and I've taken the Chrissy base, and I do the same thing.
There's a wonderful little, the Kersey Bay have book is called Deep Understanding. That's like maybe the third edition. So it does a really nice job of explaining the individual, definitely qualities, and then looking at the 4-letter code, and then even giving you information about career and relationship. And it's information. And it's not good, bad, it just is. And I find it useful.
Yeah, then I've researched that a lot.
And where, and Dr. Porco was referencing, where there was a book that came out a few years ago called, I think, The Abuse of Personality Tests. And what it was talking about was that this corporate adoption of the personality test as a meaningful way by which you can hire people. Early in my career, I worked as an industrial psychologist, giving personality tests, but I gave them when we were doing simultaneous engineering, where you got marketing and engineering and all of these groups were having to work together to build a product, and the purpose for it was, as we're talking about it here, to help people understand you're in marketing and you've gotten there because it probably fits your personality. This guy who's doing engineering or this woman who's running the manufacturing department, their personalities don't match with yours, and so it's about acknowledging that for us to do work together, we have to recognize we have different personalities and to, in fact, understand the power of those things coming together. Not, so like me, I hate timelines. I mean, literally, personally, I hate timelines. But I work really well if I have somebody who's okay with that, they just keep poking me. Because I like big picture stuff. Well, big pictures are needed, but if you don't ever get anything done, it doesn't matter how big your pictures are.
Where's it for?
What's that?
Where's it for?
INTP.
Yes?
And then how do we find out what our opposite is? Like, I took the test, but how do you find out, because I never told me?
Oh, well, one way to figure out what the opposite is to take the exact, INFP, the opposite would be ETSJ. ESTJ.
So each one has an opposite. So the E is the opposite of the I. So the T is the opposite of J.
Yeah, intuition, feeling intuition is the opposite of thinking, and it goes down the line like that.
If you're opposites, that doesn't necessarily mean that you won't work well together.
No, it does not mean that at all.
But you have to accept.
The
Their way
differences.
of being in the world is different than your way of being in this.
Yeah, and once I told my sister how this fell out, it totally explained things, because I tend to lose details, like, did I turn the tea kettle on or not? And more importantly, did I turn it off again? My brother-in-law actually once caught their kitchen on fire because he put the tea kettle on, then remembered he had to run another errand, and then he went and did that and came home and the kitchen was on fire, and my sister was, annoyed. But it explains a lot about dynamics of even brother-sister interactions. Yeah, it doesn't mean you don't belong with them. It just means you have to work at this in a little bit different way. And there are downsides, there are disadvantages to being with someone who's exactly like you, because then there's a whole realm of things that aren't going to get done or done well. Okay, well, thank you very much. Are there any other questions? If anybody's got a question, you didn't want to haul it out, come and ask me now.